Okay, everyone. Good morning. Um, so we were working our way through Rav Gaon's philosophical work, his Emunah U'B'Tochen, his Emunah V'Deus, I'm sorry, his book of beliefs and views and opinions. And a couple of people mentioned to me after last week that they struggled a little bit with my with chapter 3, in which he speaks about the unity of God. That's not good. God's one. But no, seriously, the ideas that Rav Saadia draws out of the unity of God. So just I suppose keeping it simple, when we say Hashem Echad in the thinking of the philosophers, Rav Saadia Gaon, and the Mekabalim, but for now we're talking about the philosophers. We don't just mean that God is one, as in there are not two gods. If all lions in the universe, God forbid, go extinct, and there's only one lion, we could say the lion is one. That's not what the pasuk means. It doesn't just mean there happens to be one God, not two. But the philosophers understand it to mean that God is single, is one, meaning he is indivisible. So I am divisible in a number of ways. I'm divisible because I have arms and legs and noses and ears, so I'm divisible into parts. Even I don't know, perfect sphere, about which you can't outline any features and you can't say it has arms and legs, is nonetheless divisible because you could slice it into pieces. God isn't divisible in that sense either. And therefore, the implication of that is God is not spatial. He doesn't have extension. He doesn't extend into space because otherwise you could slice him, or even if you can't physically manually slice him, because there's this bit of God and that bit of God. And similarly, God is not temporal. He's not in time because you can't slice him in time and say there's God then and God then. From which derives the idea that God is not material. He's not physical. He is above time and space. So out of this emerges the philosopher's conviction that whenever the Torah talks about God's eyes or God's arm, that can't be literal. And that's why philosophically they believe, based upon the principles that Rav Gaon himself established, in which he said that something which is impossible is a justified reason, something that makes no sense is a justified reason for taking a pasuk non-literally and taking it out of its peshat. Therefore, when the pasuk describes God as possessing physical features, it can't be understood literally. Rav Gaon also introduces the idea, which Rambam made more famous in his Maimonidean negative theology and the like, that we can't say other sorts of descriptions about God. In the same way as God isn't sliceable in space or in time, he's also not sliceable descriptively. It would be delineating God or defining him if we could say any descriptions of him, and therefore God is above description. He's infinite in the sense that he's not finite. He's not limited because as soon as he's limited, there's a middle and an edge. So he's not infinite in the sense that he goes on and on and on and on because he's above space and above counting. But he's infinite in the sense that he's not limited. You can't outline a border to him. He's not finite. He's above time and space. And I hope that's clearer or simpler than maybe the more elaborate version that I said last week. But that basically is chapter 3 in the study Gaon, that if we flesh out the concept of the unity of God, from that emerges all these other I was going to say features or properties of God, but of course we can't even say that terminology. But all these other non things that we say about God, that he's not limited and he's above time and space. I mentioned chapter 4, and I'm not going to go through that again. There are Gaon makes the famous division between mitzvahs. I think actually I said I would elaborate a little bit in this, but he makes the distinction between mitzvahs sichlius and mitzvahs shemios, which are nowadays translated as rational mitzvahs and perhaps sometimes revealed mitzvahs. Sichlios means from the word seichel, sichliot. This is, of course, the Hebrew translation of the Arabic written work of Rav Gaon. And shemiot becomes the word shema, to hear, those that which we have heard or revealed. And Rav Gaon, as a philosopher, is very interested in the balance between revelation and reason. And what do we need revelation for? And he indeed says that we don't need revelation for many of the truths that are revealed in the Torah. A clever philosopher could have worked out large chunks of the Torah. However, the Torah was revealed to us and taught to us because not everyone is a clever philosopher. It was revealed to Klal Yisrael, to the people of Israel, so that they should all know it, even though parts of the Torah are accessible via reason. The counter argument, which I suppose on first glance appears reasonable, if we think that much of the Torah is accessible via reason, then if we think human reason has an ability to teach us truths, then why shouldn't the Torah be accessible via reason? But this isn't a simple concept at all. And the counter argument would be that everything given by God is fundamentally sort of transcendent and beyond human access. And we could unpick even the so-called revealed mitzvahs, the rational mitzvahs. Are they really so rational? Is it obvious and intuitive that basic moral principles should be accessible to everyone? In a world without revelation, maybe we would be allowed to murder and steal. If I am capable of becoming richer than you because I'm better at computer programming or better at business, why shouldn't I become capable of becoming richer than you because I'm stronger than you and stronger than you and therefore able to grab that which you have? We're okay with survival of the fittest when it comes to the free market and the business world and the world of the economic world. So maybe in a world in which I'm stronger than some people. We live in an age in which being geeky is financially rewardable. Well, maybe we should live in an age where someone who's tough and can grab things is it wouldn't be a good way to function for society. It wouldn't lead to human development. So societies coalesce and agree various rules. But who says there's sort of fundamental morality that underlies that? Now, I've spoken previously about morality, plug for the series of shiurim I gave on that topic, in which I argued against this view, and I argued that morality is, at least in some basic level, accessible to human reason. Nonetheless, there are boundaries to morality which become more difficult and uncertain, and certainly for that we would need Torah. So, okay, lo seitzach, not to murder, seems a basic principle of morality. Well, I think we would agree not murdering for no reason is a justified principle of morality. Not killing for no reason, not torturing small children for fun would perhaps be a justification. But what about where there are significant needs to cause the death of others? Well, we're okay with that in certain circumstances, in war, in self-defense. So what are the parameters of not murdering? Sparta decided famously that it was in national and social interest, civil interest, they were just a city-state, it was in civil interest to put to death any children born that wouldn't prove to be fit members of society and would be a drain on society. Children born with significant disabilities were murdered, were put out of the city in Sparta. Maybe that's morally justified. Of course, we know in more recent times the Nazis, Imam came to similar conclusions. So, what are if putting to death is justified for societal considerations, such as war, maybe it should be justified even in the way that Sparta did so. What is the beginning and end of life? Again, there isn't a scientific or philosophical or morally obvious answer to that question. Science can tell us when each stage of life comes into being, and it can tell us, sadly, at the end of life when each stage of life begins dropping off, but it can't tell us at which point is the critical juncture, which we can deem there to be life and no life. So, I sometimes use the analogy of imagine a palace with 300 rooms, and gradually lights come on one by one in each room. I can determine and watch and notice those lights coming on, and I can determine those lights going off. And something like that is the process of birth and death. So if you consider death, one by one systems shut down. They don't shut down at the same rate and the same time. You have systems of hair growing and nails growing. You have systems of cellular activity. You have heart function, and you have lung function, and you have brain function, and even within the brain, different regions of the brain, and they shut down one by one by one by one. It is a scientific question that is correct, at which point each step occurs. But which are the significant ones that determine what we would say the cessation of life? Science can't answer, and that's why it's a spiritual or moral level. And we can say, the lights in the throne room have gone off, and the lights in the toilets have gone off, and in the bathroom, and the snooker room, and the lounge, and the dining room, etc. But we can't say which are the significant ones which determine that life has come to an end. Is it majority? Are there some that are more significant than others? And of course, this is why there's halachic questions around this matter. So the parameters of what justifies ending life. And when is ending life justified? And as I said, societal needs, punishment, defense, punishment of criminals, and the like. All of these are famously difficult moral questions, and that's what we need revelation for in the thinking of Rav Saadia Gaon. So the concept of revealed mitzvahs or shmiot, revelation mitzvahs, and rational mitzvahs, sichliot, is one that's become very embedded in our sort of our culture and our understanding of Yiddishkeit. But again, it's really Saadia Gaon that first formalizes that distinction, and it's a distinction that's not without controversy and debate as to how accurate that distinction is. You could argue that by definition, all Torah is revealed and therefore has to be truths beyond human reason. And you could argue that some of the things that we assume are human reason are simply because we've adopted them due to living in a sort of Judeo-Christian world. And we know that there were cultures less influenced by or not influenced by Judeo-Christian ethics, in which they took a very different stance to matters that we consider obviously moral and immoral. It's not correct that in every society, the idea that if you're rushing to work and someone, God forbid, collapses in front of you, that it is immoral to step over that person and continue. Certainly in the legal world, there is no UK equivalent of lo sa'amod al dam reacha. Don't stand by over your brother's blood. I think society would be horrified if someone collapses and you don't bother calling the ambulance. But there's no legal requirement to do so. In the UK, till fairly recently, you were allowed to be aware of a crime and not report it. There was no obligation to report a crime. To this day, that remains the case in many respects. It's been softened a bit in UK law recently with sort of if you're part of a conspiracy, then that would be different. There's mandatory reporting for certain professionals who become aware of crimes, but lawyers, certain fields of law and accountancy and so on, even teachers and doctors in certain cases. But someone who isn't a professional bound by mandatory reporting can be aware of tax fraud and most horrific abuses going on and doesn't have an obligation to report it. Israel, which inherited much of the British system through the British Mandate, did introduce such laws, and they labelled them lo talmud adam reacha. So in Israeli secular law, the name of the law of not mandatory reporting, of not being able to stand by, is known as lo talmud adam reacha, but the Western tradition doesn't have such a law. So there are things that to us are moral obviouses that at least in the legal system are not, and even in the moral system are not so clear cut. Yeah, sorry.
Well, maybe it's the wrong word, but the question is, in society, the Torah has been around for so long.
Yes.
I'm questioning whether pre-beginning the Torah, whether there was do we have these moral considerations before the Torah was given? Are we now in a post-Torah world where they're giving us these moral things, and that's the basis of society now? But I don't know, when the Egyptians when Pharaoh said, look, we're going to throw all the firstborns into the sea, did the Egyptians think that was morally wrong?
So these are very profound questions. We don't really know the answer. The question for those online is, to what degree, and I'm agreeing with you, that's why this is a subject of debate, to what degree is or are our moral intuitions based upon the degree to which biblical morality, the Torah, has formed and framed Western consciousness and Western sense of right and of right and wrong. And in a pre-Torah world, or perhaps cultures to which Torah has not yet arrived and is very foreign and distant, maybe this sort of all our moral intuitions would be completely different.
So I'm just saying whether you could deduce it.
Yes, I'm going to argue against that in a moment, but yes, I agree with the question.
There were codes of law for us.
Yes,
Amaraim
yes,
shows.
yes.
We don't know what the code
Yes.
of law in Egypt was.
Yes.
But it was similar
Correct.
to that. So
There were codes of law.
Some moral code, but they had
Though maybe codes of law, law and morality is not identical, and law can sometimes be, for example, it can be generated by morality and bring morality. The answer is we don't know entirely the answer to this question. Rav Tzaddik believed in moral intuition and thought there was moral reason accessible to all humans without revelation. Rav Tzaddik doesn't need my agreement, but I humbly agree with him. Meaning, I do think that there is moral intuition. Whilst one can argue over the edges, as I've just demonstrated, I think there are some core moral intuitions. And again, I gave a whole series on this, but I would, in very brief, argue the following 2 points. The first is that the Torah seems to have moral expectations on humans, even well before the giving of the Torah. God is able to turn to Noach and say, the generation of the flood has failed because they engaged in mindless violence and theft, Hamas. God's able to turn to Sodom and say, I'm going to turn you over because you are morally repugnant. He's able to turn to Egypt and say to Paro, at least according to the Rambam, I'm not just punishing because you're ignoring my message, my godly given message via Moshe, but I'm punishing you because who enslaves innocent peoples that move to your land? So I would argue that at least in Torah sources, there is an expectation of certain morality from human beings, even pre-revelation. The counter argument would be, well, no, there were pre-Sinaitic prophets also. You mentioned Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi, if he's Nimrod, is mixing with figures like Amrom and Shem. There are prophets pre-Matan Torah that are teaching them morality. There's Chanoich, there's Noach. Maybe the problem with the Dara Mabul, maybe the problem with Egypt is that there were revealed teachers of morality. So there's no absolute knockout blow, but to me it seems the simplest argument against this view is the Torah does seem to have moral expectations, even of humans who don't have access to revelation. Of the billions of humans who never heard about Matan Torah, and as far as we know, never encountered prophets. I think here in this room we spoke about my figment of imagination, my Mongolian goat herd, who's never encountered any revelation at all. Would we not have some moral expectations then? So this remains a subject of debate. The second thing I'd argue is often those who critique the view of that there's at least some moral objectivity and some ability to access reason, is they will bring societies that seem to behave in line with very different moral codes. I would argue that they're not behaving in line with very different moral codes. They are agreeing with a set of basic moral axioms. They are simply setting the threshold or the border elsewhere. Someone who takes a very counter to Torah stance around abortion or around ends of life and voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide and so on, is not disagreeing with our fundamental moral principles. They're also agreeing that murder is wrong. Of course they are. They're simply saying that there's a different degree of necessity that would justify it, or a different definition of when life starts and ends. But this isn't fun. It's not a disagreement around raw moral intuition. It's a disagreement about the boundaries. Sometimes actually it's a disagreement around science, not morality. Or at least their reading of science. They're disagreeing about how to understand. I'll come to in a second how to understand or quantify the world. Let me give you an example. Inca societies, yes, that used to engage in child sacrifice. They would sacrifice every day a child. I think I've given this example before. Do they have a completely different moral code in which they thought it was right to kill small children for fun? And the answer is no. They viewed this as an act of defense of society. If you didn't sacrifice a child every day, the sun wouldn't rise. So is this an immoral decision? Well, maybe not. If you believe that to be the scientific reality, that you had to appease the merciless sun god, and if you didn't do that, it would refuse to rise, then maybe this is an act of defense, and maybe we would all make the same decision. In fact, we do. I think all of us would accept if the only way to stop nuclear annihilation of the UK was to cause the death of a few innocent civilians. Of course we would do that. That's a commonality of societal decisions. So what they're arguing about is not morality, but science, pseudoscience, but science nonetheless, a view not of the moral world, but of the physical world, of how the world functions. And they believe that if you don't kill a child every day, society will be annihilated. Sparta is making decisions. I don't think based on a completely immoral worldview. They also have a degree of morality. It's a decision that's horrific from our point of view, but they view this as a defense of society. We are a city-state in a very brutal part of the world. We can only survive and flourish by military prowess and by carefully marshalling our resources. I'm told the Eskimos used to do the same thing also, very, very tough part of the world. If we can allow ourselves to have dependents who aren't going to go out to become contributing members of society, productive members of society, then our society can't survive. And therefore, sadly, we have to kill a few children in order to defend society. So again, I'm not trying here to prove one point or another, but it remains a degree of subject of debate. And personally, I think that there's good grounds for accepting Saadia Gaon's point of view that there is moral reason and not just revelation.
Saying when God created Adam, not even
Yes.
free will, but the philosophers would say that he was embedded with some inner sense of morality.
Yes, I'm not going to go here to other issues, which is, I would argue that this point of view is even sustainable by someone who is atheistic. I don't think this is from a Jewish point of view, what you said is 100% right, which is embedded in a human being, part of our Tselem and Elohim, part of our spirituality, our ability to access truths with a capital T, our ability to transcend mere utilitarian transactional life is a moral intuition, 100%. I would argue that even an atheist should agree with this. In other words, in the same way as an atheist would accept that there is basic, that we humans can access logical truths, I think they should accept that we should accept even moral truths. But again, these are al-Regalachas summarizing complicated arguments, and many Jewish thinkers don't agree with this, but Rav Saadia Gaon did believe in reason giving us access to spiritual truths and moral truths. Yes?
Superficially, it seems to be common with Karaites, is that there is a them and us approach. I.e., within the Torah, we talk about things in context of our brother.
Yes.
And outside of that, obviously,
Mhm.
but is there in fact a common theme that there's a different level of morality potentially in many areas between what we regard as people who are members of that society and people who are outside?
Okay.
But live, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah.
So many societies distinguish between insiders and outsiders, members of society and those outside society, and we have aspects of that within Judaism, no doubt about that. Again, it gets onto other issues, which is the morality of Torah. We could give a series on that. Is the Torah always moral? Are we always comfortable with the morality of Torah? I would certainly point out, though, that the Torah absolutely confirms moral responsibility to those outside Jewish society, 100%. There are certain moral acts which are considered extraordinary, which it says are an enhanced moral responsibility to someone who's a member of your family. But like, theft, deceit, murder, God forbid, all these horrible things are basic charity, sustaining sick people who are, burying the dead, looking after people. These are all absolutely fundamental obligations to Jew and non-Jew, and God forbid otherwise, and very, very clear in halacha. And they're enhanced morality, which hashavas aveda. Someone loses something, and I have to take a pain in the neck. I have to take this object into my house and start guarding it, and go to considerable efforts to seek the loser. That's considered an enhanced responsibility. And even there, by the way, the Rishonim argue. There are Rishonim that say this is such a elevated level of morality. I have to fill valuable space in my house, and I'm responsible now for someone else's property, and I have to go hunting the person who lost it. That's their problem. They shouldn't have lost it. That's a unique moral responsibility. That's only for within society. Others say that this is a type of moral contract. Since they will do it for me, I will do it for them. But if I live in a society in which others also return lost objects, of course I'm obligated to do it. Thank God we live in the UK where there is such an expectation of handing it into the police, in which case this would be a Torah obligation. Other Rishonim say there's an obligation on anyone who's living in a moral universe. So pagans lived a thoroughly immoral life. But anyone who is keeping Sheva b'mitzvahs b'nei noach, there's an obligation of we don't return an object to someone who's going to abuse it with pagan worship. But of course there's Hashavas Aveda, someone who's keeping the Sheva mitzvah enough. The Meiri goes even further and says any civilized society, even a pagan society, we should do Hashavas Aveda. So each case needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. But the idea that all humans have Tselem Elokim, the idea that all humans are made in the image of God and have moral obligations towards them is very fundamentally, and I know that sometimes, sadly, due to perhaps either theological warping or due to some of the brutality of Jewish history and the way we've been treated, sometimes this is forgotten and not spoken enough about in the Jewish world. But this is 100% basic morality. And say a society that has no moral code towards outsiders is an immoral society. And if people genuinely thought that was moral, that would disprove my claim that there is an intuition of morality. When Nazis claim to us that they believe what they're doing is moral, we don't believe them. We don't say, "Oh, Nebuch, you're just not thinking clearly." We don't believe them. We know in our own individual life that we are capable of doing things that we believe to be immoral for egoistical or selfish or pleasure-seeking reasons. So we know that humans are capable of behaving against moral intuition. In the same way as we can behave illogically, we can do things that we know are harmful for us and so on. So when a Nazi claims that they are, well, no, this is self-defense of society and, every Jewish baby represents a threat to us, we don't believe them. So non-belief of moral claims. We don't say, yeah, they're right, and they just simply don't have moral reason. We think they do have moral reason, at least by and large. There are people that are thoroughly irrational and sadly disabled in their thinking ability and so on. So it could be people of moral intuition, but we label them psychopaths or sociopaths. We label this as a type of problem in one's faculty of reason. We don't accept that this is a functioning human being. So to me, it seems that we do expect moral intuition to be a basic and fundamental part of what a human being is. I would point out that I'll just say, since you mentioned this about insiders and outsiders, the following 2 points. The first is there is a moral intuition about that. If God forbid one saw 2 people drowning in a lake, is one expected, one a close member of the family, a parent, a child, and the other a stranger? Does moral reason demand of one to save either one equally, or perhaps make a clinical assessment about which one is more important to society? I don't think so. I think part of moral reason is relationships and so on. But again, I appreciate that it needs a lot of unpicking. The second thing I'll say is that I made this claim before that even atheists, I think, should buy into this argument, and I do make that claim. The evolutionary biologists point out that there are good evolutionary and genetic reasons for tribal culture, for insider-outsider thinking, and saving members of one's family ahead of others, and then saving people that look like oneself ahead of people that don't look like oneself. There's lots of evidence that demonstrates that that's how humans work, for better or for worse. And therefore, many evolutionary biologists have drifted philosophically towards quite nihilistic philosophical and materialistic philosophical systems. Some of them are sort of leading neo-atheists, Richard Dawkins most prominently amongst them. And I would simply say that this demonstrates one thing and one thing only, which is that being a good scientist doesn't make you a good philosopher, because it's philosophically nonsense. You can absolutely believe in evolution and still believe that we have evolved such that that gives us access to certain points of reason. And if you are a believer in evolution, evolutionary biology, then there are clear survival benefits in being able to think logically, and being able to realize that, I don't know, that 3 minus 1 equals 2. If you're attacked by 3 hyenas and you kill 2 of them, and you can't see the third, and you aren't able to think logically and realize if you've removed 2 things from a pile of 3, there's still 1 left, then you're going to be less likely to survive. So basic reason, and even sophisticated reason, could well be a product of survival necessity. And there's studies with birds and so on, whether they notice if you add an egg to the nest or take away an egg from the nest, and which creatures have the ability to count, which don't. But I'm just using this as an example of basic reason. It may well have arisen, according to that school of thought, through evolutionary necessity and giving you a survival advantage. And nonetheless, we think this has given us a tool to touch absolute reality. We think there's a basic logical reason that actually dictates this. So out of necessity has developed the ability to engage in logical reasoning, and therefore there's no reason to believe that to be troubled if out of survival necessity also emerge moral reasoning that gives us the ability to touch moral truths in the same way as we can touch logical truths. So as it happens, I don't think this is a unique Jewish claim, a monotheistic claim, or the like. But again, this is beyond the scope of our argument. Saadia simply argues and fleshes out this argument in some ways in the way I'm doing, that moral intuition, moral reason exists, and therefore some of the mitzvahs in the Torah should be understood as reasonable, and other mitzvahs in the Torah are unreasonable, in the sense not that there's a problem with them, but there's nothing in them that human reason could arrive at. And these are mitzvahs shemios, received wisdom. It's interesting because this has remained, I wasn't going to go into all of this with so much detail, this has remained a running debate to this day amongst Jewish thinkers. And there's a very famous piece from the Beis Halevi, the founder of the Brisker dynasty, who argues against this piece of Rav Saadia Gaon and argues that it's an unhelpful distinction. And he makes the argument that we could imagine societies that would flourish on immoral behavior. And, he says big fish eat little fish, and that's how some of them survive. And we could imagine a functioning society that flourishes with immoral behavior and so on. So this remains a hot debate amongst thinkers to this day. I'm simply sharing with you Rav Saadia's view, which Rav Saadia needs no agreement from anyone, including myself. But I think I humbly think has a lot going. Doesn't need my argument, of course. There's a lot going for it. I humbly think there's a lot of arguments that we can put forward towards it. On we go. And forgive me for belaboring this point. Sorry, this is meant to be a philosophy show, so I make no apology I'm apologizing for going through at some length. I can't say enough how basic and fundamental Rav Saadia Gaon's Emunah V'Deis, his books of beliefs and opinions, is in Jewish philosophy. We're learning, ladies and gentlemen, the first Jewish book of philosophy ever written. So we have to spend some time going through chapter to chapter, that which he says. I know some of the ideas he's expressed have become so intuitive that they kind of feel obvious, but that none of them are really obvious to this day in Jewish thinking. His next chapter deals with rewards, punishment, divine justice, free will. Basically, humans have free will, despite God's foreknowledge. Rewards and punishment are essential for justice. God's knowledge doesn't compel human action. And even seemingly undeserved suffering, it does fit into a just framework, into a framework of justice. It could be a test, it could be to purify someone, it could be preparation for reward, but we can expect and should expect to live in a just universe. Rav Saadia Gaon also speaks about why the Torah mentions reward and punishment, and he says that partially it's a motivational thing. Many of us are motivated to keep Torah and mitzvahs because of reward and punishment, but ultimately we need to know that actually it's the other way around. Keeping Torah and mitzvahs is because it's the right and proper and moral and spiritual thing to do, and reward and punishment are consequences of injustice that needs to be corrected, rather than being the motivation for doing that which is right and avoiding that which is wrong. If we do that which is right to get reward and we avoid doing that which is wrong in order to avoid punishment, we are living in a transactional universe, a universe of bartering with God. That's better than the alternative, because at least we do that which is right and don't do that which is wrong, but that's not really ultimately what reward and punishment is about. Nonetheless, Rav Saadia Gaon thinks that we can explain why the Torah speaks about reward and punishment as a realistic reflection of how humans work, in which reward and punishment is part of the consideration that we make in factoring in our decisions. Thus says Rav Saadia Gaon. I'll mention in this context that here Rav Saadia Gaon brings the doctrine of reincarnation and rejects it. It's interesting, the first explicit mention of the concept of Gilgul, or reincarnation, in Jewish literature, to the best of my knowledge, is in Rav Saadia Gaon. So it's become like a very sort of well known sort of theological view that people think is sort of essential to Judaism. Metempsychosis is another word for transmigration or reincarnation. Gilgul, it means a transfer of the human psyche. I have to remind myself of that word by checking my piece of paper. Psychosis. There's either transmitigation, which means movement of the soul, or metempsychosis, which is a soul movement. It's just Greek and Latin. Yeah, I googled it to check if I had misunderstood the words before shares. Okay, sometimes you have to have words in your armory to impress people. So, but when you have to look at a piece of paper and remind yourself of the words, it somewhat ruins the impact. Okay, but either way, Gilgul, the idea of reincarnation, was put forward by Jewish thinkers, evidently there's no Gemara or explicit published source, publicized source pre Rav Saadia Gaon that takes on this doctrine. Now, there are works like the Zohar, which assume this doctrine, which are traditionally dated far earlier than Rav Saadia Gaon's works, but they certainly weren't in the public domain. So there may have been mystical sources that mention these ideas, but in the sort of publicly accessible canon of studied works, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Midrashim that were publicized, the works of earlier Jewish thought, and the like, certainly Tanakh. There's no explicit sources to the idea of Gilgul. The sources that are earlier than that are mystical sources which were not publicized, were not available, were not accessible. And Rav Saadia Gaon is the first sort of canonized, if you like, publicly published source that references it and disagrees with it. He doesn't think it makes sense. So there are many Gemaras that link different figures to each other. The question is what the Gemara means, and there's three ways of understanding these sources. For example, the Gemara says Pinchas Eliyahu, or the Targum Yonason says that Bilam and Lavan are one and the same person. Now, there's three ways of understanding it. It could be soul reincarnation. It could be literal. They just lived very, very long lives. And it could be conceptual, that there's something linking them or identical about their spiritual root, their way of behavior, their spiritual destiny, some commonality between them. So Pinchas and Eliyahu, they both are great people, but also have the mid of Kanaos. The Gemara is not coming from nowhere. The Psukim use very similar terminology to describe them. They both have this mid of zealotry. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Both of them we find praised and criticized for this middle of zealotry, but nonetheless it's a strong personality quality, a spiritual quality, which you don't really find used to describe anyone else in the whole of Tanakh. So none of these sources are explicit in assuming Gilgal. Again, it's just interesting how embedded these ideas have become in our consciousness. I'm not taking sides on these matters. I have no idea if reincarnation occurs or not. How on earth am I meant to know it? The answer to that, I'm simply sharing the history of Jewish thought with you. I would say that I do think it's important that we think clearly, and I would say that if someone said to me, do you believe in Gilgal? Probably my response would be I can simply share the sources with you, and there are sources that say this and sources that say that. But the more profound response actually is, and here I'm God forbid, I'm not taking sides in the debates between the Mikobolim and others, and I certainly have no wish to pick a fight with figures like Arizal and so on who thought these were really important Jewish ideas. So, Chas v'Shalom, I'm not in any way getting myself into that. I simply want to say that a reasonable response was, just before we have this conversation, can we just pause for 1 minute, and do you mind just defining the term? And this is really the fundamental problem here, and the reason why learning philosophy, I think, is important, even for those who are absolutely committed to the Kabbalistic side. And this isn't a debate. I want to emphasize this. This is Eilu Ve'elu Davidikim Chaim. This is a conversation that's taken place across the generations. So if someone says, for example, let me take an extreme example, just to make it clearer. A soul, in the doctrine of Gilgal, a soul can be reincarnated in an animal or a stone. Let's take a stone just for simplicity's sake. So what of the person is in the stone? Well, their body is not in their stone. Is their mind in the stone? Is there consciousness in the stone? Do we know what consciousness in a stone would mean? Okay, so you'll say the neshama is in the stone. But what do we mean when we say neshama is inside you? Where is your neshama? Is a neshama a physical thing that can be inside you? So there's problems here with definitions. What aspect of me is being is being reincarnated? What aspects of me are being transferred over, and where exactly are they? So, if you ask someone to point to themselves, or even where's my neshama, we intuitively say here or here, depending on your personality. It's an interesting test to do. I'm going to ask someone to point to themselves, and where would they point, right? Where do we experience ourselves? By the way, this is something that's shifted over societies and culturally. Very, very interesting, where people have felt their sense of self. If someone points to here, you say, where are you? And they say here, then you may wish to understand what sort of person you're dealing with. Okay. So what I would say is that part of the point of understanding these conversations is, it is no doubt that Klal Yisrael in many ways has accepted the thinking of the Mikobolim, and this has become, in a sense, almost hashkafically in many ways, paskins, if you like. I'm simply, and I certainly have no ability to disagree with an Arizal who tradition says, well, it had Gidor Yedion, these truths were revealed to them and so on. But I do think there's a value in hearing why Rasad Gaon was so bothered by the idea. And the reason he's bothered by the idea is because define it. And I don't mean this in literal sense, it doesn't make sense. By that I mean, if those that believed in it were figures that clearly did understand the idea. But there's a problem in defining it and understanding in what sense this terminology is meant of reincarnation. Where is the soul reincarnated? Now, I've picked a fight with reincarnation in a stone. I would argue, though it's more subtle, the same problem with reincarnation in an animal, and even indeed reincarnation in another, from human to human. What of me lived previously, and in what sense am I responsible for that, and so on. These are all matters beyond our scope. But either way, Rav Gaon rejects reincarnation. Both. Sorry. Yeah, he doesn't understand it.
Now, was it whether accepted or was it just?
I don't know. He says there are those who believe in reincarnation. He addresses this in two ways, both in the next chapter, which we're going to get to, which is about soul and death, and injustice. Because one of the arguments for reincarnation is it's a useful tool to justify or to explain injustice, seeming injustice. You see someone suffering. They are innocent. Let's take the most extreme case, God forbid, an innocent child that is suffering. How on earth theologically are we meant to make sense of that? What can justify a 6-month-old stricken with terrible affliction? Well, we have a very good answer. They are a reincarnation of a previous life in which they did terrible things, and therefore they're now being punished for that. And there are figures, by the way, to this day who make such claims, there's a fig actually that spoke many years ago in here in the shul in Israel, and it's quite a wide online presence. I think a very problematic person, and unfortunately, the stock picture that's often used to convey his image is often standing there in front of the Kodesh here and there, who has said things like victims of the Holocaust were punished for sins they had done of reincarnation. People afflicted with blindness, this isn't a punishment for misusing their eyesight in previous lives, and that where this can be taken can really go in very painful directions. But this is the kind of thinking that takes place sometimes. And the reason for reincarnation was as a way of justifying or explaining suffering of seeming innocence. And again, I'm taking sides against this expression, this idea, 100%. But the core idea, I believe. Well, starting on, I believe Arizal. I'm not in business arguing with anyone.
Current thinking. What do you mean by current thinking?
I'm just saying there are thinkers today who continue to express it in this most extreme form. There's figures in 2026 who have vast online presences, listened to by sometimes tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are still voicing versions of this in that particular form. Very, very difficult, very, very, very problematic. I mean, we're looking at even just theologically. Yitzchak Avinu was blind. Yaakov became blind near the end of his life. The Gemara tells us about Rav Sheshes, who was blind, Rav Yosef, who was blind. So, like the idea that you can turn to someone who's suffering in that way and say, well, I have a nice theological solution for you. You're an example of what goes wrong if you misuse your eyesight to look at improper images and use that as chizuk for youngsters struggling with misuse of the eyesight is just appalling. Okay. I was asked to keep this to a philosophy share. I sometimes descend into history, but my intention was not to descend into polemics. So I won't say more than this.
Was blind.
Yitzchak was blind. Yeah, Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes in the Gemara. Yitzchak went blind, and Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes in the Gemara. Where the Gemara says Sagina. By the way, the Gemara it's interesting. The Gemara terminology for someone who is blind. We'll test you on another good word in a moment. Is Sagina, too much light? What's it called when you say the opposite of what a term means? Antonym, but there's another word for it where you label something by euphemism. Yes, a euphemism where instead of saying labeling something, you use the opposite terminology. So the Gemara uses the terminology saginaha. Someone who's blind says too much light. Now the Mekabolim, interestingly, take this term literally, and they say blindness gives someone greater insight and greater light. And someone who sort of lives in such a spiritual dimension where they don't have the sense of sight because they see beyond that, at least in the context. I don't know if the Gemara called all blind people that, or only it needs a sort of researcher into Babylonian at the time, whether this was a common used term or only a Jewishly used term. But they at least say this. So the idea that you can sort of facilely summarize in this superficial way divine justice is again, not everyone who believes in Gilgulim is saying this sort of stuff, God forbid. But there are those that say this sort of terminology. Either way, Rosh Hashanah doesn't think that this is a good tool to explain divine justice, nor does he think it has a source in the Torah, and he doesn't think this is what belief in the soul and life after death means. Yes.
Of a famous rabbi in Austria,
Yes.
who went to the zoo and they went up to the reptiles cage.
Yes.
And he started speaking to one of the snakes. Then, if you are Moshe or whatever, come over and say hello.
Yes. There are many tales, Hasidic tales in particular, and other tales of Mekabolim, where there are stories like that, where there's a wild dog that bothers everyone in the town, and he goes and speaks to them and says, "Soul of so and so, the Russia, go back to your creator. You've achieved your tikkun." There are Dibuk stories that took place with the most famous and well-known figures in at least living memory of when all of us were younger. There were people that remember these stories still 20, 30 years ago. Very famous stories with the Chafetz Chaim and the Dibuk, brought by Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. I'm happy to give maybe a share on another occasion about mysticism for the rationalists and what I've a certain take on what to make of these such incidences. But it's beyond the scope of our topic today. But there are many tales. I am okay. Whatever. It's maybe once we'll give I don't know if I've ever done sort of just as a raw topic mysticism and rationalism. We spend a lot of our time talking about it, but I don't know if I've ever try to make sense of this debate on sort of a deeper level. Why is it that some humans are mystically inclined and others are rationally inclined? And what are each school meant to make of the other? And are there useful, is there useful conversation that can take place? I hope everything I'm doing is demonstrating. I think there are useful conversations to take place. But um, are there mystical practices that we should engage in as 21st century Jews who maybe haven't? And I think the answer is yes, absolutely and profoundly yes. And I think there's good things we can do with it. So okay, beyond the scope, we're meant to be talking about Gaon, not Zobin. Okay. Next chapter, he deals with death and the soul. Again, things that I'm not going to belabor this point because these are things that sort of, the soul is spiritual, it's immortal, it's distinct from the body. It survives death and retains awareness. This is important, consciousness. And after the death, the soul is judged and receives reward and punishment. And here he speaks a bit about reward and punishment and defines reward as closeness to God and punishment as distance from God. So let's just unpick all of that. We speak a lot about the soul, the inner me, the sense of self. It's not obvious that the soul should be defined as my consciousness or my sense of self, and it's not obvious that, or at least it's not obvious that it is solely my sense of self and my inner sense. We are aware that we are conscious. Do mitzvahs impact our consciousness, or do they impact some sort of spiritual self beyond that which is accessible and conscious? This is also one of the big areas of debate between the philosophers and the Kabbalists. Saadia Gaon, to some degree, equates the two, and therefore believes that consciousness survives after death. Is that? I just want to ask: is that a philosophically provable position? Is it a tenable position? Is it?
It's intuitive.
Sounds counterintuitive. Why?
Because consciousness, it's like I would have thought the definition of consciousness is something that when you're alive, you're aware of.
Mm-hmm.
I would assume that with the brain shutting down, death, that consciousness would disappear.
Okay, so I asked this question because to the philosophers, consciousness was a very reasonable way of labeling and defining the soul and what we mean by an immortal existence. To the Kabbalists, the soul is something extra conscious, beyond a human being, something spiritual that survives. And to many in the modern era, that's a better position than consciousness, because consciousness we see deteriorate, and therefore it's easier to talk about the soul. I want to point out, though, and that's why I asked the question, because survival of consciousness after death seems counterintuitive. We see that actually consciousness declines as the brain sadly begins shutting shop at the end of life, at as death becomes very imminent. And in certain cases, medical challenges and the like cause consciousness to even decline significantly before that point. And therefore, to the modern ear, it sounds very difficult to believe that consciousness can survive post-death. Again, the matter of consciousness is famously fraught and very, very complicated. What we mean by consciousness and how consciousness emerges and how consciousness interacts with our physical bodies. We can cut apart the whole human being and we can see it's simply made up of physical parts. And it's true that some of these physical parts are arranged in a very complex formation, but we don't know how any of them lead to consciousness. And this remains a fundamental problem in science and in philosophy. As far as we can tell, with all the enormous complexity of the neurons and everything else, it's simply a complicated arrangement of physical matter. And we don't understand how complicated arrangements of physical matter can give rise to a me, to an awareness that there's a me here that is actually experiencing things. As far as we understand, this table, it doesn't experience anything. So how does a very complicated arrangement of tables start experiencing things? Atoms don't experience things, they're just little chunks of matter. So in what way can complicated arrangements of atoms give rise to consciousness? By the way, this is a very hot topic because we now, all of us have access on our phones and our computers to complicated arrangements of matter that seem to mimic conscious behavior in a very incredible way. You can have conversations with AI and perhaps not be aware that one's not talking to another conscious being. And yet, almost no one takes seriously the idea that AI has genuine consciousness and that there'd be something immoral in shutting it down or the like. There is some discussion in Silicon Valley around this, but basically, I don't think anyone philosophically minded takes it that seriously. But we don't really know much about consciousness. We don't know what the seat of consciousness is. So all I will say is that there are many models of consciousness, but I'll just share with you two just to bring out this point. Model number one of consciousness is that the brain gives rise to consciousness somehow or other. We don't know how. And in that model, as the brain deteriorates and sadly post-death descends into just mush and breaks down, then clearly consciousness also disappears. However, there's another model in which the brain is the interface with consciousness, but consciousness doesn't sit in the brain. It's simply the means through which consciousness interacts. And a bit like if I have a complicated computer, which I use to communicate with you, but nonetheless, there's a consciousness behind it, which isn't the computer. And you can therefore smash the computer and the consciousness would remain. The analogy they give to this is imagine all human beings were born with goggles in front of their eyes, and they notice that over time the goggles deteriorate, they become scratched, they get discolored, and vision deteriorates with the deterioration of the goggles. If I told someone that one day with the removal of the goggles, your eyesight would be restored to perfection, they would say that clearly is impossible. We know that the ability to perceive, to see, is linked to the health of the goggles, and to the degree that goggles deteriorate, eyesight deteriorates, and therefore if the goggles were completely destroyed and removed, eyesight would disappear completely. That would be intuitive. And yet, the goggle analogy helps us understand that were we to remove the goggles completely, eyesight actually would be restored to perfection. And therefore, we don't know which model of brain, mind, mind matter, the relationship. We know so little about consciousness that the truth is these questions remain up in the air. And therefore, philosophically, Rav Saadia Gaon's claim that consciousness is an eternal quality beyond time and space and immortal is a justified claim, a reasonable claim, at least through revelation. God's revealed to us, and there's nothing philosophically unsound with it. I would argue that not only is it a reasonable claim, I actually think philosophically it's the better position to take. So I think there are reasons to believe that's a better model of consciousness than the alternative. But again, it's beyond the scope of our discussion. Let's just try and pick out a couple of other features from this chapter. Rav Saadia Gaon, again, to the best of my knowledge, is the first thinker that sort of explicates and speaks at length that the idea of reward and punishment is closeness to God and distance from God. There are psukim and chazals that sort of indicate something in this direction. It's even a posuk, li kivas elikim li tov, the closeness to God for me is good, and the like. But the Torah doesn't actually say this clearly. The Torah seems to speak in quite material terms about reward and punishment, often this worldly reward and punishment, by the way. If you keep the mitzvahs, then you're a malkush, etc. The agriculture will flourish, you'll have safety, and if you sin, then you'll be destroyed, there'll be war, and so on. So the Torah speaks often about reward and punishment in this worldly sense. Chazal speak about it in different ways. There are Chazals that say similar ideas, and Rav Saadia Gaon quotes them, of course. He says that in Olam Haba there's no achila and shtia, there's no yeshiva and amida, we don't sit, we don't stand, we don't eat and we drink, but nehenin miziv hashchina, we benefit from the radiance of the divine. There's some intense pleasure in a spiritual existence. Rav Saadia Gaon, again, in sort of philosophical terminology, it spells this out and grounds this and systemizes this in the most thorough way. And with that, we will finish chapter 6. In Hashem, next week there probably is no share. I'm due to be in Israel next Sunday. Please God, my flight should. Yes, everyone is invited to join me. Absolutely, yes. But we'll stop here for today, and that is Rav Saadia Gaon in Perek. Well, yes.
Not saying if he's given free will, I mean, God tells him to do the Achai.
Yes.
Why didn't he say this is morally wrong? I don't even feel for me.
No, but the question is discussed. Again, it's well beyond the scope of this share. But Avram, who it's a classic of Jewish thought that we have free will, and it's a classic of Jewish thought that Avram is capable of challenging God about the morality of his decisions, because we have psukim that they are shofet kol oretz, they ask for mishpat, and yet when it comes to Akeda, he doesn't turn to Hashem and challenge. Very, very difficult.
So just
yeah, we'll get to Chasimas.
Incorporeal or corporeal.
Corporeal, and we'll get to that also. Yes, he believes in physical bodily resurrection, and we'll come to that. We'll come to that next, either next week or 2 weeks' time, depending on whether I'm here or not. Okay, thank you so much to everyone online.
Thank you.
Please, thank you.